Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement regarding the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that, quote, "it is an expression of aspiration, it will have no impact on New Zealand law"?
The Honourable Bill English on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, it is worth noting that other countries such as Australia announced their support for the Declaration in recent years, and despite that members' dire predictions, Australia, for instance, hasn't been handed over in its entirety to its Indigenous people.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. What does he say to legal expert May Chen, who says that to the contrary, affirming the principles of the Declaration actually influences New Zealand courts and the Waitangi Tribunal?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Ms Chen would know that New Zealand courts have already imported reference to the Declaration, in fact the draft Declaration, into judgments in the New Zealand courts. And actually the government, as the member will know, is in constant negotiation with Maori about the regulation and ownership of resources and various other property rights. And I've found their expectations to be pretty pragmatic, quite progressive, where they're keen to get on with creating jobs, lifting incomes, getting better education, and actually they're not that preoccupied with the draft Declaration.
A supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Does the government's affirmation of Article 4, which gives Indigenous people the right of self-determination, autonomy and self-government, mean that the government will give to the Tūhoe what they're seeking, those exactly same things? If not, what does it mean?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, well, the answer to the question about Tūhoe is no. They would not be getting the right to self-government. The member knows that that's a silly question. The government's, if the member understands the process, the government has made a statement of affirmation of the Declaration, and the degree to which New Zealand affirms that declaration is in the statements made by Minister Sharples, Power and the Prime Minister.
Supplementary.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, does the government's affirmation of Article 26, which gives Indigenous people the right to land which they have traditionally owned, occupied or used, which actually covers the whole of New Zealand, covers the whole of New Zealand, mean that individually owned land will now be subject to treaty demands, or was that affirmation just an empty gesture?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the various statements from various ministers have made plain, issues around land are determined within New Zealand's legal framework, and affirmation of this declaration doesn't make any change to that. However, we are very pleased to see that Maori are keen on the idea of running their own lives, completely different than Labor's view, which is that the government should run their lives, they should be dependent, and there's nothing that Maori can do about that.
Chris Tremaine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister. Has the Prime Minister seen reports contradicting dire predictions of dangerous divisions between Māori and Pākehā?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not just reports. It's not just reports that we see. As I said earlier, the government is interacting daily in quite often quite contentious issues, actually, with a range of Maori groups, and doing so in a very positive and progressive manner. And I think the dire predictions by the opposition are more to do with their loss of the Maori vote than anything else.
A supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Does the government's affirmation of Article 17, which requires the government to seek consent from Indigenous peoples before passing laws, mean that Māori people have a veto over the laws? If not, what does it mean?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as we've said any number of times, all those processes carry on within the framework of New Zealand law. As it happens, the current government is in coalition with the Maori Party, and we often seek their agreement to pass laws. That's democracy, and we don't see what's wrong with that.
Mr. Supplementary.
The Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, does this government have as its aspiration for New Zealand Article 26 of the Declaration, which states, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied or otherwise used or occupied."
The Honourable Billingham.
Mr. Speaker, as I stated earlier, all those matters related to land are dealt with inside the current New Zealand framework, which is, not altogether straightforward, because our common law tradition, for instance, does recognise long-standing traditional occupation of land. We're negotiating every day with Maori interests over control of land and resources, and doing so very productively.
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Miller.
Mr. Speaker, again, it's unusual for me to take a point of order on behalf of Rodney Hyde, but that was a very clear question. Does the government have an aspiration? There was a whole pile of stuff to do with dealing with the issue, but the fundamental question as to whether that particular clause was the government's aspiration or not was not even addressed.
Interesting point of order, but it would be my interpretation, listening to the Minister's answer, that in fact he explained what the government's aspiration was with respect to the treatment of land. And while it may not have been exactly the answer the member might have wanted to hear, with that kind of question, when a member's asking about an aspiration, there's no specific answer to that. And I think I can't ask a minister to give any particular answer to that kind of question.
Point of order. I think it's an important issue here, Mr. Speaker, because it may be that you could understand from that explanation, but I think it's fair to say that most people in this House could not understand from the Minister's explanation whether or not it was the government's aspiration to hand land over to Maori or not.
I must say, though, remember, it's a nice try, but since the Speaker does have to be the judge in these matters, then I have to base the judgment on what I understand from what the Minister said, and that's the way I see that answer. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. Do any of the affirmations in the Declaration that the government has agreed to represent an extension of Maori rights? If so, where?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, all the issues that have been referred to here will be dealt with inside the current legal framework of New Zealand. And that's not a radical view. We've heard today that the US has now stated that it is reviewing its position on the DRIP.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, you will recall that was a very specific question. Do any of these affirmations represent an extension of Maori rights? I would have thought I could have got a direct answer to that rather than a fudged answer.
I've got to agree on this occasion with the Honourable Leader of the Opposition that was a very specific question. There was no political loading on it. Asked, are the rights extended in any way? And I believe there is a real interest in the answer to that question, and I'd ask the Honourable Bill English to...
I answered the question, point of order, I answered the question quite directly to say all these issues that the members have referred to are dealt with within the existing legal framework of New Zealand.
Order. I'll ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to repeat his question so everyone can hear it, because the issue is talking about rights. Now, within the legal framework in New Zealand, there may be subtle changes in the rights people have. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area, but I think an answer that more directly addresses the question the member asked, I think, is on this occasion warranted. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, do any of the articles in the declaration that the government has just affirmed represent an extension of Maori rights? If so, where?
The Honourable Bill English.
Speaker, the answer is the one I gave before. All Maori rights are subject to the existing legal framework in New Zealand, and that does not change as a result of this. It does not change as a result of this affirmation.
Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Point of order is being heard.
if the answer was the answer that he just gave.